Hello and welcome to Senior Solutions, where we bring you topics affecting seniors and their loved ones. I'm your host, Mindy Felinton. Have you ever found yourself, or perhaps your parent or a loved one, in the emergency room and, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? There's so many things that are happening there. Well, my guest today is Dr. Amy Schiffman, and she is a board-certified emergency room physician turned house call doctor, and she is the president of House Calls, LLC. And welcome, Dr. Schiffman. Thank you for being here today. So there's so many things that people are in panic mode and they really don't know what to do. And thank you for being here to help people to navigate through the emergency room and what they should do. So that being said, what are some of the things that, particularly when you're dealing with a senior in an emergency room setting, that people should think about? What should they do? How do they react when they're in that situation?
Well, I think, first of all, I love the fact that you use the word navigate, because it truly is a giant ocean out there that I'm not sure anybody has a good compass for. So I think that ultimately part of the emergency room experience truly does begin before you get to the actual emergency department. It really begins in a patient's home. And sometimes it begins not at the second that someone calls 911, but the preparation should be happening clearly before then.
So let's go back to that point in time. What are things that people should do in advance of that possibility of the 911 call?
I mean, I think the most important thing to realize is it's sort of not a necessary if, it's a when.
When, yeah.
65% of all people over the age of 65 have the potential to end up in the emergency department in any given year, which means it's really common. People end up in the emergency department, and it's so chaotic and it's such a crazy situation that preparation is probably the most important thing that you could possibly do, because for emergency physician, information is everything. Key. Because it's going to save time, and then it's going to save your life. So I would tell everybody, make sure you know all of the important things about yourself that you would want someone else to know, and write them down. Because you may not be able to communicate. You may have somebody with you that can't communicate those things for you. So there are a lot of ways to do that. So the first thing I tell people is just be simple. Get somebody to write down the names of all of your medications. Of course, we know those may change every single time you see a physician. Those changes can be made. I mean, optimally, you'll be making changes to that list every single time. But in general, it will give somebody a clue at the very bare minimum as to what some of your medical problems are. For example, if you're on a high blood pressure medicine and your list contains a high blood pressure medicine, you can automatically assume that someone will know you have hypertension. So you want that list to be visible to everybody. But that's not the only thing you want on that list. You want the next of kin. You want your emergency contact information. You want your insurance information. You want a lot of things on that piece of paper, or you can get a file of life from your local EMS. You want something that somebody can take with them in the 911 vehicle to the emergency department to both educate the EMS staff as well as the emergency room staff about what's going on with you, so that you don't have to necessarily tell the story, because we all know once you get to the emergency department, you're going to meet so many new people. They're all going to be asking you the same questions, and it's nice to just have it all written down.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean,
and have it in a place where they would know to look. So what do you recommend? The old proverbial, put it on the refrigerator?
Put it on the fridge, because that is where people are going to look. Folks come in and they say, what are your medical problems? What medicines are you taking? I mean, obviously, a lot of people love Ziploc bags or, old shopping bags to throw all their bottles of medication in. That can be major chaos, because once those make it to the emergency room, they have the potential for getting lost. Right. They have the potential for pieces of them to get lost. And, it requires somebody to kind of go through them, and some of them may be expired. You're not taking them anymore. So I always tell people that the garbage bag full of medicines, while it's better than nothing, it's definitely less optimal than an up-to-date medication list.
Which leads me to a question, though, that I have now with all the electronic... That was a good sigh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I think that ultimately we are living in a nation right now that is very interested in making things easier, and we're making steps towards that. However, we're all little silos, really. You know, my practice is a silo, another practice is a silo, the hospital's a silo, and it's that sharing of information that I think people desire, but we haven't quite gotten there yet.
So in the dream world.
In the dream world, whatever is in my computer as the medications that someone is on could just be looked at by the emergency room staff and be like, oh, okay, well, these are their meds list. But unfortunately, that's not entirely true, and given some of the new rules within Medicare and some of the high-tech laws, a lot of information is hard to share in what might consider to be the most efficient way. We can't email stuff, for example, if it has any patient identifying things for HIPAA laws. Yeah. So you find that people have to fax stuff or transmit things in a way that's not always what you would imagine if it was just people doing business on a day-to-day basis, because the security is not there. So what you have to do is, I encourage patients, if their doctor has taken the time to put their medication list into a computer, ask for a printout. Then you don't have to write it. You don't have to write it out, and then at least there's something.
Right, and then each time you go, if there's a change,
it's updated. Right. I mean, obviously so, but if you go see I call them the ologists. If you go see the first ologist and they do a bunch of stuff with your meds, and you go see the next ologist and they do, you know, they all have their own silos, so they may not be sharing. So hopefully there's somebody that's sharing, that's at least keeping track of all those medication changes. Sometimes
like their general practitioner,
a GP, but
or their internist.
Again, somewhat fantastical thinking that will always happen, because people often only see their GP or their primary care doctor, you know, with certain frequency, but sometimes they're seeing their specialist a lot more frequently. Perhaps those are the doctors that actually have a better, you know, finger on the pulse of somebody's medical problems or their problem list or their medication list.
The ologists.
Get the ologists. You got to have your ologists.
Okay. All right. So back to the preparation.
So you want to have an idea of what you would want to happen if you went to the emergency room. I mean, honestly, it's a very simple algorithm. Either you're going to have semi-chaos, which is sort of an implied problem when you go to the emergency room because there's so much going on there, or you want a more controlled version of that chaos, which basically is informing the providers of what is going on with you. And like I said, so you go back to, you know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 years before, God forbid, something should happen, and you're already ready. You've got the thing on the fridge. Everybody knows who to call in case of emergency. But more importantly, it's to sort of also prepare for sometimes the worst case scenario. Perhaps you're having a heart attack. Perhaps you're having some other very traumatic event. And the number one question that is sometimes asked is, what would you want in case the worst was to happen, in case your heart was to stop, in case your lungs were to stop? And that is the question that is often very difficult for people to both think about in advance and for doctors to ask about in advance. Because who can imagine what it would be like to have to say, well, you know, what would you want if this were to happen? It's always so imaginative in many ways, so it's hard to prepare in a realistic way. However, it is probably the most common question that's asked, particularly for seniors, is when they come into the emergency room, what is their DNR status? That's sort of how it's sort of the colloquial term.
Meaning do not resuscitate.
The do not resuscitate status. In the state of Maryland, there is something called a MOLST form. It's the Maryland Orders for Life-Saving Treatment, and it can be downloaded as a PDF. I encourage all of my patients to begin browsing it because it comes with a whole set of instructions of how to think about each of the different questions. And it's extensive. It asks questions about, would you want a blood transfusion? Would you ever want dialysis? Would you want fluids? Would you ever want anybody to help you while you breathe? It's not just as simple as do CPR, don't do CPR. It asks a lot of questions, and it may be the type of thing that you sit down with your children, or children can sit down with their parents or grandparents and ask some of those questions in advance, so that some of the decisions that unfortunately sometimes have to get made aren't made on the fly, aren't made
emotionally,
and also aren't made knowing that that's not what that person would have wanted. Perhaps there is what is called a living will. Someone has prepared their wishes in a more legal way, but that information's never been put onto a Maryland form or some sort of a form that is recognized by providers. I think that if you could have the dream world is that if you called 911 and EMS came in and they found a list of your medications and your MOLST form on the refrigerator, that would lower the level of chaos to that sort of controlled chaos that everybody sort of is willing to tolerate in the emergency department. And I also think that, understanding that when you call 911, there is going to be a certain amount of expectations that people are going to have if they can go to this hospital or that hospital or this hospital. And sometimes that happens, and I don't want to speak for EMS, but sometimes they have to go where the hospital is open. You know, emergency departments can close if there's too many folks there, and sometimes you're going to end up in a hospital where you may never have been before. So it's nice to say, oh, take me to this hospital. They have all my records. I've been there before. They know me. My specialists go there. But that hospital's closed that day, and so they end up taking you somewhere else. But if you had your MOLST form and your medication list, that would at least make that transition to a new provider much more palatable.
And with regard to that issue of the asking to be taken to a particular hospital, in certain situations, do they not have to take you to the closest one?
There are definitely, and I don't represent EMS, but depending upon the type of problem, they will definitely take you to the closest hospital that may or may not be a special hospital for that. For example, in trauma, you always want to go to a hospital in general that has a trauma center. EMS is pretty good at making those decisions in the field, and if you're having a stroke, they want to take you to the closest stroke center. Most hospitals around here have really good catheterization labs for heart attacks, so you're kind of good everywhere. But there's definitely hospitals that do specialize in different things, and EMS is very aware of what those places might be. So upon request, you may not be able to end up in the right hospital, but based on the problem that EMS identifies when they get there, they will most likely move you to the hospital that is most appropriate.
And of course, a lot of our conversation presupposes that the person who is in need of care is able to communicate. Then there's the...
Well, if they're not able to communicate, EMS has to do what they do best, which is make a lot of, really fast and educated decisions in the field and decide what needs to happen next.
Yeah, but of course that's another reason, even more so, to have the stuff on their refrigerator.
Because it'll really help them to be able to differentiate between what may have happened and what isn't happening. I mean, I think that if there is somebody that has a caregiver in the home, that caregiver should be educated by any family that may have hired them. What I sometimes find is that sometimes caregivers know a lot about the patient, but they don't know necessarily all their medications, and so they really just have to be able to say, here's the medication list, or they may not know all their medical problems, but here's a list of the medication problems. If there's any barriers to communication via either the patient themselves or anybody who's a caregiver, that information should be loud and clear right on the refrigerator for somebody to have easy access to.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that with regard to the caregiver. Well, you would hope that they would be aware of the medications.
Aware, exactly. And certainly they can usually give a good story as to what may or may not have happened. If somebody fell, or if somebody suddenly has weakness or is complaining of difficulty of breathing, those types of things should probably be easy to communicate in that regard, but sometimes the historical nature of somebody's health may be more difficult.
Okay. Well, we're going to get ready to take a short break, and what I'd like to do when we come back is move from the preparation, now that we know how to kind of set that stage for before that 911 call is made, how to get everything set up so we have contained chaos. And then now we're in the contained chaos, some recommendations for people and things to think about. So we're going to take a short break, and we will be right back.
Body language can tell you all sorts of things. Like someone is having a stroke. Know the sudden signs. Learn fast. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call 911 and get them to a hospital immediately. Learn the body language and spot a stroke fast.
Welcome back to Senior Solutions, where we bring you topics affecting seniors and their loved ones. I'm your host, Mindy Felinton, and I'm joined today by Dr. Amy Schiffman, who's here talking with us about how to navigate the emergency room. Welcome back, Dr. Schiffman. Again, thank you for being here. So where we left off, you were talking about the pre-planning. How do we plan for that 911 call? So now let's take us to the contained chaos and what people should do when they're in that situation and expect, and how to best deal with all of the things that are going to now happen in the emergency room.
Well, I think the number one thing that I should tell everybody is that everyone, if possible, should try to have an advocate with them in an emergency department. Having somebody with them is like a voice that can walk out of the walk out of the room and say, we need someone in here, or someone to sort of just even hold your hand, that advocacy is probably the number one thing that I recommend, is that having somebody to speak for you if you can't speak for yourself, or you can't speak loud enough because it's too loud. But once you come into the emergency department, you're going to meet so many different types of people. You're going to meet the registration staff, you're going to meet a tech, you're going to meet a nurse, you're going to meet a doctor, and if you get admitted, then you're going to meet a whole new set of people. You're going to meet the admitting doctor, and if you're there during change of shift, you'll meet the new ER doctor, the new nurse, the new tech. And there's a lot of new faces, and
wow.
you oftentimes have to understand that those are called transitions of care, and that during those transitions, you want your story to remain the same. It's like a bad game of that, where you whisper in someone's ear. That's kind of what it's like. I think that emergency departments do a great job at maintaining that information. So that's the first thing to say. But in order to sort of optimize that, what you want to do is have that advocate there, have your information ready, so that information is actually written down somewhere, so that it doesn't just go from mouth to mouth to mouth. It's actually written down so you can just sort of hand it off. I jokingly used to say to everybody they should make an app where you tell your story one time and then you just go, listen. But I think, listen to my story. Yeah. That's my next idea. But ultimately, I think that people just have to know that you're going to meet a lot of new people, and that each of those transitions is an opportunity for you to sort of not be able to tell your story the way you want it told. But like I said, I think emergency departments do a great job, and advocates can really help you out. And whoever that advocate is, it may be a loved one, it may be a caregiver, it may be a friend, and it may be a relative. It could be anybody, but generally I say to folks, if you want the best care in an emergency department, there needs to be one little squeaky wheel who can sort of represent you if you can't get out of bed or something like that.
Your mouthpiece.
Your mouthpiece, exactly.
Yeah, my mother always said that.
It may drive the emergency department staff sometimes crazy to have somebody who's constantly, nudging them to do this or do that, but actually I think it can actually help a person get more attention sometimes.
Well, speaking of that, are there ways to better approach when you're the mouthpiece to approach the staff?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that some people are under the impression that there's not a lot sometimes going on in the emergency department. People seem sometimes like they may be sitting around, but that's absolutely not the case.
Yes, it does look like that.
It does look like sometimes, but it's definitely not the case. I mean, basically, there is so much going on, and if you have a room full of sick people, there's constantly things being done. Sometimes you have to get the labs, then you have to wait for the labs, and then you have to get the labs back, and then you have to make phone calls to other doctors. I think that ultimately the emergency department is a place where you probably get the fastest care that you can get anywhere. You need an ultrasound, you need lab work, you need a CAT scan. It can all happen in that one little place. I mean, it's sort of, it's like fast-forward medicine. I mean, imagine if you go see a doctor and you're like, my stomach hurts, that doctor is going to need to get blood work, and then to get that blood work back might take 3 or 4 days, and then he or she's going to contact you and tell you what to do next. All of that is happening within the span of minutes to hours in an emergency department. So things are happening really, really quickly. I think that ultimately people want to know what the results are of tests that get done in the emergency department. The best way to do that is to just wait, because those results will come, and it's really not up to the staff necessarily of how to run the test. They have to go down to the lab, and then they have to come back up. So I tell everybody, meeting your expectations of what you want to happen with the expectations of how sort of the hospital runs is critical. And it will actually lower someone's anxiety level significantly. You just sort of say, no one's ignoring me, it's all getting done, and if we can just meet our expectations, then I think that can also help folks a lot.
Yep.
Obviously you want to be somebody who wants to get the information, and certainly the thing that I tell everyone is once somebody communicates information to you, ask if you can get a copy of the lab work, because you may need that when you get discharged from the hospital, the emergency room. Someone might want to say, do you know what your blood work looked like? Ask for it. If you don't ask, you may not get it. And that's definitely something that an advocate can do.
Yeah, that's a great helpful hint. Because
a copy of an EKG. Imagine that you go to the emergency room and you get an EKG and they say, okay, everything's fine, and they do some blood work, everything's fine, you can go home. Ask for a copy of that EKG and bring it to your cardiologist so he or she can see it, because as you remember, we're all silos. We're all silos. So we don't necessarily have the ability to look into a hospital's records to see what an EKG may or may not have looked like, or what that person's blood values or what that CAT scan looked like. And sometimes the readings that are done in the emergency department may not be the final read, So they may not be able to give you a copy of the actual results, but they can certainly give you a copy of the actual study. So you can ask for a copy of the x-ray, a copy of the CAT scan on CD to show another physician before you leave.
Yeah, that was very helpful.
For patients who are getting admitted, you should still ask those questions. You should still get copies of the blood work so that you can have them. I think that ultimately what happens is that people just kind of assume that things are in the computer and they don't know what that computer is necessarily able to accomplish. But having a copy of it is key.
So speaking of getting admitted, there's been some conversation about the admitted versus observation.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that so people have a better understanding of how to navigate that component?
Sure. So there are within the hospital, if you get admitted, you can get admitted to either an admission status or to an observation status. And sometimes you don't really know what that is. It could be the same beds. For all you know, you could be on the third floor in an observation status, or you could be on the third floor as an admitted patient. Some hospitals do have what they call OBS units, which are actually separate parts of the hospital, which are really intended for patients who might be short stay, who might be getting a faster workup, who might be able to go home within a certain number of hours. The important thing to realize, observation versus admitted status, is that it will impact significantly upon whether or not you are able then to move on to a sort of a skilled nursing facility or a rehabilitation unit after the hospital if you might need that. Medicare requires a 72-hour stay in order to be eligible to go into rehabilitation, but that 72-hour stay must be as an admitted patient, not as an observation patient. So what I tell my patients is, please ask what your status is. This is not a question that anybody used to have to ask. You're in the hospital, you're admitted to the hospital. Mm-hmm. But actually, you may not be in what is called admitted status, and it is to your benefit to advocate if possible and if appropriate to maybe say, hey, listen, what is my status? Am I an observation patient or am I an admitted patient? Because that will actually impact discharge significantly. I mean, one of the things that I always tell everybody is that somebody's plan for discharge actually begins at admission. Because what you have to be thinking to yourself is, what has happened in the past 24 hours that has gotten me to this place? If it's a fall, does that mean we now have to start thinking about, maybe we need to start doing things to our home to actually make things safer? Or is this fall going to put me in a position where I'm going to no longer be in my home and I'm going to be in a rehab center? And will I be able to take care of myself when I go home in a way that is safe?
So what are things that you could recommend to people, if you can, to help move along the admission process? And I guess, well, before that, the question is, what truly distinguishes I'm being observed versus I'm admitted?
So obviously people who have, and there's a certain number of guidelines that folks use, they're both institution as well as Medicare dependent, that will decide whether or not somebody becomes an OBS patient or an admitted patient. Like a simple urinary tract infection may not end up needing to go into an admitted status, but certainly somebody that may have a stroke would certainly be an admitted patient. Mm-hmm. So those types of distinctions are often not clear necessarily to everybody, but there are people who specialize in the hospitals, and that is actually what they specialize in, is to helping make those distinctions as to what kind of bed or status somebody might end up in.
What's that title of that?
I'm sure it depends hospital to hospital, but there's case managers, and the physicians are making those decisions too. So it's certainly worth it to ask, what is my status, just so that you know what the options are going to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what happens, and what do you recommend people do if they do remain in the hospital?
Well, I think it's reasonable to begin thinking about what's going to happen next. There's a lot of things that doctors want to do in the hospital that will make sure that your discharge is safe and that you don't have to come back to the hospital. Certainly hospitals are under a tremendous amount of pressure right now to make sure people don't come back to the hospital due to some new Medicare laws that are going to keep hospitals from getting paid for what are called readmissions. But while you're in the hospital, you want to start asking, what are the criteria for me to get discharged? Where am I going to go after I get discharged? And then what's even going to happen after that? Because the discharge planning is not just necessarily discharge from the hospital. It may be then down the line, 2 weeks, then you have to get discharged again from a rehab facility and then possibly admitted to a place that you had not thought of living. Perhaps you're going to end up in an assisted living for a short period of time, or maybe even forever. So there's a lot of things to think about that are somewhat depressing in many ways, because you think to yourself, oh my goodness, I've fallen and now I can't walk. Things can change in an instant. So you want to be thinking to yourself, what are my loved ones going to need to help me do in order to get back to either where I was or at least to a new baseline? So in order to accomplish some of that, there has to be relationships made with discharge planners, with the physicians who are taking care of you, know what your criteria are for a safe discharge, not be too eager to leave, and, you know, I'm sure no one really loves being in the hospital, but also, you know, you don't want to push things, but also you want to say, you know, I think, is it ready for me? Is it time for me to go yet? Sometimes the answer is quite obvious, and sometimes it's a little more subtle, like you don't want to have a fever when you leave the hospital. You don't want to have chest pain or shortness of breath when you leave the hospital. So be sure to tell folks that on the day that you're being discharged so that you don't end up having to come back. And make sure that you understand the discharge instructions, because that can oftentimes lead to a readmission.
Which is why it's good to always have an advocate with you for that.
An advocate who can write things down. Bring a notebook with you and have that person write things down, which doctors came in at what time, so that you can be reminded of what some of the decisions that need to be made are and what some of the important salient points about your own health could be. Because really, ultimately, this is all about being an advocate for your own health. And, you know, hospitals are there to help. So you want to be able
hospitals.
Yeah.
And that being said, what do you recommend that people do if they don't have a loved one near them? Say, my daughter's out in Texas, I'm here.
This is a huge challenge. I jokingly tell a lot of my patients that I'm very good at spending other people's money. Because what ends up happening is if you don't have somebody that you can rely upon, you either have to sort of do it yourself. You can always hire folks. There are geriatric care managers locally. There are advocates that you can hire to come and be with you. There's always folks that you can hire to come and sit, like a sitter. You can call a local home care agency and see if you can hire somebody to be with you in the hospital as a second set of eyes, to make sure there's no falls, to make sure that you can eat and spend time with you, someone to hold your hand. There's a lot of things that you can pay for. Unfortunately, beyond that, there's not that much. I think people really have to think about that in advance, is as you get hospitalized or, God forbid, you know, stay in a nursing home, who is going to advocate for you outside of the hospital or outside of where you are in order to help things keep moving forward.
Thank you. Well, this was really, well, one of life's many challenges, right? This was really helpful. I think it was very informative for me to plan, because that 65 number's coming up. So, not great ratio. And thank you again for being here. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, Dr. Schiffman, how would they do that?
The name of my practice is called Capital House Calls. You can look us up on the web at www.capital.com. Our number is 240-744-0001, and someone would be happy to talk to you about getting a house call.
Okay, wonderful. Again, thank you.
You're welcome.
And if you have any ideas for a topic you'd like to see on Senior Solutions, please feel free to email me at seniorsolutionsTV@gmail.com. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.